Born in Fargo, lived on a farm at Davenport, about 25 miles southwest of town. I lived on the farm till I went away to school. McDonald was a neighbor of ours. Alec McDonald.
Mm-hmm.
His farm is 2 miles west of our farm. So we grew up knowing, as buddies. Mac had a cousin named Floyd Plath, and, an older gentleman. He was a businessman, had a machinery dealership in Kindred, and also lived on the farm, which was right between Mac's and our place. So I would either ride my bike or my pony over to Mac's and, spend some time with him. And one afternoon, about 4 or 5 o'clock, I was coming back home, and Floyd landed. He had a runway right by his yard, and he had an Aranca Chief, a little Aranca, two placed side by side. And he landed, and I just steered. It was about a block into his farm. I rode over there, and I had been fascinated by airplanes, but I didn't know, I'd never been around them and never had ridden in one. And he taxied right into the yard, right in front of the house, spun it around, and I walked around the airplane and said, "Hi, Mr. Plath." He said, "Hi, Darrol." And I said, "I've never had an airplane ride." And he called into his wife, "Esther, I'll be right back. Jump in." So he took off right from the yard, right from the driveway. And I was just absolutely thrilled.
Oh.
I was about 11 years old, probably been in 1941. Probably a few months before Pearl Harbor. This was in summer, and then
Sure.
Pearl Harbor hit December 7th. That just started the whole thing. And he just gave me a short ride, but did a little pull-up over a grain elevator and did some negative G's, and I'd never felt that before, and it just fascinated me. And I read books and drew pictures of airplanes, and in high school, well, I'll make a long story very short. My parents went out to Arizona in the wintertime, and they did spend some winters out there. And the first time they did, they didn't want to interrupt my school because they didn't have a place to live. So my mother's sister, my aunt, she was 21. She worked at the Merchants Bank as a bookkeeper and had an apartment in North Fargo, a 2-bedroom apartment. So they asked if I could stay until Christmas with her. And I started school at Roosevelt on the north side. It was only about 2 blocks from where she lived. So I did that. Christmas came, and they didn't want to interrupt me again. They said, "Why don't you just stay and finish out the year?" So I did. Then I went to Fargo Central, and it was during the war, and the school in Davenport was losing a lot of teachers, especially the men were all gone, and quite a few parents sent their kids to Castleton, Kindred, or Fargo to school. And there were 4 or 5 of us that lived in Fargo, either roomed with relatives or with someone. Well, when I was a junior in high school, I really had the flying bug bad, and I would hitchhike out to the airport, and the war was just over then. It just had, they just started doing some GI Bill training, and Dakota Skyways was an FBO right in that brown hangar right south of the old tower, that round hangar. That's where Dakota Skyways was. They had a number of training airplanes, a lot of GI Bill students. And so I asked them about flying lessons, and I was the only non-GI Bill. I was a high school kid. They didn't have any other high school kids taking lessons. And my dad would give me $5 a week. He put some money in the savings account. My aunt would bring me $5 from the bank every week for spending money. And you could get $8 an hour for dual instruction. I could get 3/4 hour for $5. So I spent I'd hitchhike to the airport, out to Hector, spent my $5. I'd get about 45 minutes of instruction. And my instructor had flown, had been a Navy pilot in World War II, Oscar Ness, and real nice, just a fine guy. And he joined the Air Guard, was flying 51s, and I just thought that was fantastic. And then he was instructing. So when spring came, he said, you're going to have your dad's permission before I console you, which I didn't really realize. Well, my dad came home early to put the crop in, we had a hired man that stayed on the farm while he was gone, but he came home like in April or the first part of May. And so weekends I'd go out to the farm and stay with Dad. And this one weekend I said, I need to have you come in town and sign something. Sign something? What's this all about? And I told him, well, I'm taking some classes at the airport. I didn't say I'm learning how to fly, and so it ended up that we had coffee with Oscar Ness at the old terminal coffee bar, and he convinced my dad that he should sign that release so I could be soloed. My dad was very hesitant. I think he was a little upset with me that I did this. He was just, but he did sign it. So a couple weeks later, I was taking a lesson. We taxied out the north end, and Mr. Ness said, okay, kid, I'm getting out. I'll watch you do 3 landings. I couldn't believe it. So I soloed. I just turned 16. That was in 46, in the spring of 46. Now when I was in college, now we'll move ahead a few years, I was going out and renting an airplane once in a while, and they had Veronica Champs, and they had some PT-26s and PT-19s that they'd brought in surplus. And I got checked out in one of those, which fascinated me. Well, I was living at Fraternity House, and heard a knock on the door, and this guy came to see me, and he was a mechanic at the airport that had bought a PT-19, and they were selling him surplus. They were coming in from Canada, and he lost his job and got transferred someplace, and he had to sell the airplane. And he asked me if I could buy it. I said, no way. I'm just a college kid. My dad has put me through school, but I can't buy an airplane. He kept pestering me, and he stopped out about once a week, and about the third time he stopped out, I said, what are you asking for? Well, he wanted $700 for it to begin with. That was just, well, there was no way I was even considering that, but I liked the airplane. It was a nice PT-19. Well, it ended up, he had to move, and he said, how much money can you put together? And 4 of us put in $50 a piece. We bought it for $200. And I was the only one who knew how to fly, and I just barely had a private license then. So I did turn into a flight instructor with some of my buddies, and it's just amazing we survived all that, because I didn't know much about flying myself, and here I was teaching them how to fly. But one of them sold his $50 share, and then the 3 of us stayed with it. And about that next summer, I took it out to the farm and landed in a hayfield. My dad he didn't care for that. And a friend of my dad's convinced him that I'm going to get hurt in that airplane. So my dad told me, sell it. So I did. Sold it for $200 to a guy that I asked him if he'd flown one. He said no. And I said, well, I can fly with you and show you, how to fly it. He said, well, I have a cousin that was a World War II bomber pilot, and he's going to check me out in it. I heard about a week later that a PT-19 crashed out at Sky Ranch Airport. It was right where Sunmart is on the south side. There was a landing strip there, and that's where the airplane was that went out there, and it was just, really broken up. And what happened was they came in on final in the first landing and pulled full flaps and stalled out. He just went in on the nose, and neither one got hurt. They've got bruised up, but both seat belts broke. And they were very fortunate they didn't get hurt. So years later, I came off active duty in the late 50s, and I started ag flying, and I brought an airplane in for a little repair work, and I was waiting for it, and I was sitting in the sun beside the hangar with this other ag pilot from Christine, and we were talking about flying and learning how to fly, and I told him I'd had a PT-90 in college, and he said, yes. He said, I know that. And I said, how come? Well, he said, I was the one that crashed it. Harvey Allman, he'd flown I think B-25s in World War II a little bit. He said I was on current, and I hadn't been in one, and I just stalled it out and landed. And so we kind of laughed about that. So that's what happened to that airplane. I did join the Air Guard when I was a senior in high school at Fargo Central. That was in 40, no, I was a junior. That was in 1949 when the unit started, when they started the Guard unit, the Air Guard. And one of the recruiters came out and he recruited, there were about 45 of our senior class that joined the Air Guard. And we, of course, they assigned us to different jobs. And I was assigned to aircraft maintenance because I wanted to be around airplanes as an A&P mechanic. Well, I wasn't very mechanical, but I was around airplanes, which I appreciated. And I had a 3-year enlistment. And then Mac joined the following year. He joined in 48. And he just started NDSU then. In 1950, I decided to go into advanced ROTC. Well, I had to drop out of the Guard because of you couldn't belong to both organizations. So I dropped out of out of the Guard, started ROTC, and 2 weeks later the Guard was activated for Korea, which would have changed my whole career. Didn't know they were going to be activated. But I stayed in school and got my commission, and I really had decided on a career in the Air Force, and that was my goal. I was going to go on active duty, and that was going to be my career. So I graduated, and when we graduated in 52, of course, it was during the height of the Korean War, kind of towards getting close to the end of it, which we didn't know. So we got our orders and our commission and our active duty orders and our diploma all the same day. And so I was anxious to go on active duty and report for pilot training. Well, an interesting thing happened. My orders started me in August, so I had to spend the summer working on the farm, baling hay and combining. And finally, I reported in 6 August 52 to Perrin Air Force Base, which is right north of Dallas. And I checked in, and the base adjutant said, "You're at the wrong base." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "They just decided to not have pilot training here anymore, and they called it FlyTAF, Flying Training Air Force, and we're going to be a crew training Air Force with FA-6Ds when they come out of the factory brand new. We're going to start a training air crews." Well, so I was the first one of 46 people that came into the base. 2 other ones from Fargo, Dick Ames and Charles Finnegan, who was a very close friend of mine in high school and college. They reported in after I did. So we all were pipelined to other training bases. They had 9 civilian contract schools then that they would train, your first primary, your first 6 months. I didn't get my orders till about January. So we sat there from August until January, but it wasn't all bad. I was very fortunate being the first one because I got assigned to an aircraft maintenance squadron. He had brand new T-28s, which was a brand new trainer then. And it was built, the cockpit was built similar to the F-86 cockpit, only, it wasn't a jet, it was a radial engine airplane, but all the controls and the instruments were just very similar to an F-86. Well, the maintenance officer took me along on test ops, and he knew I had some previous flying, so he'd let me fly the airplane. Then he'd fill out his paperwork while I was running the test ops. So I got quite a few rides in the T-28, which was really good training for me. Just by chance, it really helped when I went into pilot training. Then, in the meantime, I'd gotten engaged. I met Jean in college. She was a senior when I was a freshman, and she happened to be homecoming queen that year when she was a senior, and I really thought she was a beautiful lady. And a fraternity brother of mine who was also a senior was dating her, and we were both in the ski club together, and I kind of got to know her, thought she was a very nice person. Well, at Christmas time, he went home on Christmas vacation, and my folks were in Arizona, so I stayed at the fraternity house, and I called Jean and invited her to a movie, and she got a big kick out of it because a freshman. But she knew me from the ski club, so she said she'd go, so she probably wanted to see the movie. So that kind of ignited things a little bit, but we didn't date a lot, but we stayed in very close touch. She went into business. She started the magazine called The Town Crier, which evolved into Binford's Guide, which evolved into The Guide. So she started that, and she had her own business going. And then I'll move ahead. When I was down in Texas at Perrin Air Force Base, we did get engaged. She came down on a trip with another friend. They'd been down in Texas. She stopped, and we dated, and I offered to get engaged to her, got her a ring, and we set the wedding date for the first part of February in Fargo. And I was delaying en route to my pilot training class. We had a lot of faith and guts, you might say, to set a wedding date when things were changing so much. And we sent invitations out, and had a big wedding at the Olivet Church here in town, where her folks had belonged. And our marriage was on a Friday evening, and I had to report for pilot training on Monday morning in Moultrie, Georgia. No interstates, and I had a brand new Oldsmobile, and we drove kitty corner all the way across to Georgia on our honeymoon to start pilot training. So that was pretty interesting experience. We didn't have any housing. They didn't have base. It was a civilian contract school, so we had to find our own housing in that little town of Moultrie, which we did after being in a motel for a few days. And then I joined up with 2 or 3 other friends of mine who'd been at Perrin, also came, and they were married at the time. They were all waiting to meet this new wife of mine, so we remained friends for many years later. So that was 6 months of primary, flying the T6. And when I graduated from primary, it was in the middle of summer. We went to Bryan Air Force Base, Texas, which is at College Station, Texas, right where Texas A&M is. Now it's a closed air base, but it was a nice base then. We really enjoyed it. We lived in housing right next to the campus of College of Texas A&M. So that was where I checked out in the T-28 again. Flew that for about 2 or 3 months, and then checked out in the T-33. That was my first jet that I flew. So we graduated from there in December of that year of 53. And there were 65 in my graduating class, and we had all kinds of different assignments, from helicopters to B-29s, B-36s, which was fairly new then, and F-84s, but they had 6 F-86 assignments. Now, when we graduated, we could put down our preference, the first 3, 1, 2, and 3, but the instructors really assigned us. I mean, they look at your preference, but I put F-86 in all 3 of them, which I'm sure they laughed about. And I did get an F-86 assignment, which I was very fortunate about. They were brand new then. I mean, they were quite new. And everybody wanted to fly the F-86, the Sabre. So I went to Nellis Air Force Base, that's fighter gunnery school. And they also trained F-84 pilots at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix. But I didn't want to fly the 84, I wanted to fly the 86. So and this Finnegan, who I'd mentioned before, who I'd gone to high school and college with, and we were a pair together, and then he went to different flying training bases than I did, but we joined up at Nellis again, and we got the same flight instructor. You'd go through with the same instructor, 3 students and an instructor, 4 of us. So we went through training together in the F-86, which was a lot of fun. And it was really a thrill to fly that airplane. We flew the F-80 for about 40 hours. That was like a T-33 with a single seat in it. And we flew that, did some strafing and dive bombing and low angle strafe and all that. Then we checked out in '86, and we had no idea. We thought we were all going to Korea because that's where all the graduates were going. At that time, it was the busiest airfield in the world. They had a big sign by the main gate, busiest airfield in the world. They trained, they had over 100 F-86s there, and probably that many F-80s. And in the morning, on the first takeoff, we'd have 50 to 100 airplanes taxiing out. And it was just incredible. The flights of 4 were going out, one after another. So it was very intense training, and we did strafing and dive bombing and skip bombing, and we did high altitude gunnery with the 50 calibers on a rag, they called it. They'd drag it behind another airplane, and we'd did a lot of that. So then when we got our orders, the first orders came out for Korea. They came out about a month before graduation, and we just assumed that's where we'd be going. And right at graduation, they called a number of us, maybe 15 or 20 of us, into a building and gave us a briefing that we were going to be reassigned to a new base that had been a World War II base, and they were reopening it for a new mission, and we were going to get brand new airplanes right out of the factory. Well, we had no idea what this was all about, but it was Clovis Air Force Base, which is now called Cannon, down in New Mexico. It had been a World War II bomber base, but it had been closed, for 8-9 years, I suppose. So we drove to Clovis. They didn't have any housing on the base, so we had to search for a typical thing, and we lived in a motel for a couple of weeks, and we just had real tough times. And we ended up finding a house, and it was not what I would have picked today, but we had no choice. So we moved into that home in Clovis, and it was really a thrill to get into a new squadron. Now I was a very brand new graduate from pilot training, and had been checked out in the F-86 and thought I was probably the hottest fighter pilot in the world. They said, you're going to have a mission that's going to be called a Special Weapons Mission. And that's the first time I'd ever heard special weapons. And they said, we're going to fill out applications for a top secret clearance because it's a very unique mission. And you're all going to have to get a top secret clearance before you do that mission. So we're going to put the application now because they have to do background checks. They do that right around your home area and everything. I really didn't. I just thought, I took it for granted and didn't really give a thought of what it really meant. Well, then when we get down to Clovis, we were told that the new pilots were to go to this one certain area on the base, and I went over there, and here it was a big fence around it with guards, and it was a very classified building. So they briefed us on the mission a little bit. They told us that special weapons meant that we were going to be training to drop an atomic bomb. And I thought, an atomic bomb, that's bomber business. Well, this was a new bomb built for a fighter, for a new delivery method called LABS, Low Altitude Bombing System. And so we had to wait for about a month to get our clearances come through so we could go start classes. And once we got that top secret clearance, then we started classes on studying. Well, we'd go every day for a couple hours and study about this bomb. And they had diagrams of it, and they had a shape, which was a bomb without the nuclear in it. And so it was pretty complicated at that time because I didn't have a degree in electrical engineering. There was a lot of wiring and a lot of things you had to know about the bomb, and it was really more memorizing for me than it was just the practical looking at how this bomb worked, and if you started having problems, how you detect the problems, how you could fix them. So it was really a matter of doing a lot of memorizing on my part. And we were tested. Every week we'd have a test on all this. And if you didn't pass the test, you were transferred to another base. So we really worked pretty hard at, we didn't want to be transferred. So that's why we were called a fighter bomber wing. Now some of the F-86s were assigned to day fighter wings. And later on, when the D model came out, which was the one with the radome in the nose, then they were fighter interceptor wings, but we were a fighter bomber wing. Our secondary mission was day fighter, but our primary mission was dropping an atomic bomb. This was towards the end of 1953, or the beginning of 1954. That was really the height of the Cold War, because we had a huge threat from Russia at that time. And of course they had atomic weapons also. And you know, we had pretty good intelligence, and they of course did too, so it was really a matter of deterrence, really. Our country never wanted to be the first one to drop the bomb, but we wanted to be able to retaliate immediately. So that's what this was all about, was immediate retaliation. We got orders. We were all called in, all 3 squadrons on our base were called into the base theater, and we were briefed on the fact that we were going over to Europe. And we were going to be based in France. And they were building new bases in France, around 10 of them. And not all for the same fighters, but different for transports and bombers and that type of thing. And so we were going to, there was a NATO commitment to have a wing of F-86s with that mission, with the atomic mission, in place by January 1st of 1955. That was a NATO order. So we started preparing then. We knew we'd be leaving for Europe sometime in the fall of '54. And so we were, in the meantime, we were training very heavily in F-86 for that new mission. And we had a range, a practice range, only about 30 miles off the base. And we'd go out there clean without tanks on, with a canister of practice bombs in it. They were a lead, 9-pound piece of lead with a smoke charge in. And we started doing at first we started doing Immelmans, come in at 500 knots, right on the deck, 50 foot, and we'd pull up into a 4G Immelman. Immelmans were when you get on your back, then you roll it out and you fly the opposite direction. So we did that for a couple of months. We did hundreds of Immelmans, and we'd toss these bombs. And our F-86s were specially instrumented. They had a lot of instruments above the shroud, and they were gyros so we could do this Immelman perfectly and they were non-tumbling gyros, so when you get on your back, they don't tumble. And then the G meter was primary. They moved that right up to the center, so you kept it right on 4 Gs, because it had to be very accurate. If you got a wing over, the bomb would be tossed a different direction. And so anyway, that was a lot of work. We'd go out 3-4 missions a day. They're only 35-40 minutes, and drop 2 or 3 of these. Then if we did real well and qualified, we could go to air gunnery and practice, which we all really enjoyed doing, and some high-angle strafe and high-angle bombing and skip bombing, conventional gunnery. So we had 2 missions, the atomic mission and conventional both. So it was a lot of work. We really flew our butts off, just flew every day, 2-3 times a day. We finally got our orders to depart. The base wasn't ready yet in France, and it kept delaying and delaying. We thought we'd go in the middle of summer, which would have been the right time to take a high flight over the North Atlantic, because you just don't do that in wintertime. Because, see, we couldn't refuel the F-86 in flight. We had to land all the way, we had to hedge hop all the way across. Because max range was about 2 hours and 30 minutes, real max. Usually 2 hours was pretty max, but if you really went up to 40-some thousand feet, you could get 2.5 hours out of it. So it was rather limited in range. Well, we finally got our orders in November to deploy to Europe. Well, 75 airplanes took off out of Clovis, New Mexico in flights of 4 by squadron. And by the time we got to Limestone, Maine, now we landed the first night we spent in Alexandria, Louisiana, the second night in Dover, Delaware, the third night in Limestone, Maine. So it took quite a while to just get to our departure out of the U.S. In the meantime, we lost one airplane in Dover, Delaware, and the pilot survived it though, but totaled the airplane out. And so we spent, in fact, I remember we landed at Pope Air Base in Carolina for noon lunch, and it was Thanksgiving Day. We had turkey in a mess hall on silver trays. And then we got to Limestone, Maine, and by that time we had airplanes starting to scatter with maintenance problems, and they were changing flights. It was turning into a real, I hate to say mess, but by that time it was really interesting. And that's where we went into our, what we call poopy suits. There was our immersion suits. They were terrible. They were a rubber immersion suit with rubber bands around the wristlets, around the neck, and very, very uncomfortable and very cumbersome. But we had tested them at Clovis in the swimming pool for leaks. Then they flew them in a transport over to Limestone. And that's what we had to wear on our over-water flights. And it was just, you could hardly get in the cockpit. You had to have the crew chief help you, and you could hardly move. And the cockpit wasn't that big anyway. It was just a real hazard in itself. So we took off in flights of 4. We always flew in flights of 4. Beasley was the flight commander in my flight, and Tony Bartello and Don Ron and myself were the wingmen. And we took off for Limestone. Now gets to be a real story. We took off from Limestone, Maine to Goose Bay, Labrador. The weather forecast changed when we got midway over Mont-Gelais, that's up in Quebec, and they told us to return to Limestone. We just passed the point of no return. They had a blizzard on the base, but we had to press on. We got about 15 minutes from the base, and we heard a lot of interesting garble on the radio, and the flight ahead of us was trying to land in this weather, and one of the pilots in the flight was our wing commander, Brigadier General Wisnan, just had made brigadier. He was a World War II type, and he got shook off the wing. He wasn't leading the flight. He was flying wing, and he got shook off the wing and did a roll in the soup and recovered, climbed up on top, just about out of fuel, and the tops were about 16,000 feet, and he was circling over the base and was in a total panic. So Beasley, my flight commander, told me to move out to number 5, and he joined up on Beasley's wing. So I moved. Now we're in a 5-ship formation, and the weather at that time was 0-0 on the base. We didn't have, radar went off the air, they lost current on the base, runaway lights were out. Of course, it was the daytime. So we had what they called ADF, just an automatic direction finder, low frequency radio, which was about 5 miles off the base. And Beasley he decided to keep us all together. If we'd have split up into flights, he's too hazardous. Now we're in a 5-ship formation, and we're starting our penetration to land. And I never saw anything until I touched down. And he split the runway. I mean, to do an ADF, he tracked from, outbound tracking about 5 miles with a crosswind and in a blizzard. And we all landed on the runway. And I had moved into the slot because I knew it would, if I was on number 3 on the wing, the runway wasn't wide enough, so I moved into the slot like the Thunderbirds. I had my nose about 4 feet behind the tailpipe of Beasley. And as soon as we touched down, I thought for sure I'd overrun or would run into him, so I stop-cocked the throttle, shut it off, got on the brakes, and tried not to skid, but did heavy braking. And when I stopped, I opened the canopy, and I couldn't see anything except snow. And the Jeep drove up, And the snow by that time was about, it looked like it was darn near a foot deep all over. And I slid down, he didn't have a ladder, so I slid down into the Jeep, and I was about 1,000 feet behind the other four, so I stopped pretty quick. And then we were stuck there for 2 weeks. The general put Beasley in for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and all the three of us for air medals. We never got them, though, because it was a SAC base, and they weren't issuing medals for that type of thing. But it was they've written that up in a number of stories about that. So we spent 2 weeks there. Then we took off for Greenland. And that was an interesting runway. We landed in Narsarsuaq Air Base, which is called Bluey West 1. It's on the southern tip of Greenland, and you have to fly up a fjord. And the runway was an uphill 5,000-foot runway with hard-packed snow and ice. And we didn't have drag chutes, or we didn't have hooks or anything. So we had to be sure we landed minimum speed going uphill, because there was a 300-foot drop into a housing area off the end of the runway. And you couldn't make a go-around because there's a mountain off the end, 7,000-foot mountain. So once you saw the runway, we'd fly and trail with our gear and flaps down. We met a seaplane called an SA-16 duck butt off the southern tip of Greenland. He'd circle, and we'd meet him, and he'd lead us up this fjord in trail. We were all four of us, maybe 500 feet behind each one. And then I could see the runway up ahead, a black runway. But it wasn't black, it was ice on it. And then we all landed, we all made it. Everybody, 75 airplanes made it through, 74, we'd lost one by then. And, but we weren't, when I landed there were only probably a dozen of us that had gotten that far. The rest are all still behind us. And we spent another 2 weeks there. Spent Christmas in Greenland. It was nothing to do, just an open bay barracks and an officers club. And it was, we had a number, it was dark all the time, down to 30 below at night. And, our airplanes were all sitting outside being cold, so hydraulic fluid just dripping out of them. A round patch, a red patch underneath each one with hydraulic fluid. And you wondered how it was going to run after sitting there for a couple of weeks. So, and we had so many dry runs where we get suited up in our poopy suits, which took about an hour, go to a briefing, and then say, oh, the weather's bad. And so we did that maybe 4 or 5 times. And finally one morning we left. And there we went to Iceland, to Keflavik Air Base in Iceland. It wasn't a real long flight, about an hour and a half, but very hazardous. We took off downhill, single ship, and it was overcast. Not real low, but then we joined up on top. And we climbed to about 30,000 feet, and we spread out. I looked down, and I could see white caps. 30,000 feet and icebergs all over, just icebergs and white caps. And I'm not an overwater guy. I never was in single seat airplane, single engine airplane. And we landed on an icy runway in Keflavik and spent 4 days there. And then we had the longest leg from there down to Prestwick, Scotland. And that was at least a 2-hour flight. And water all, the whole way. No emergency landing spots at all. New Year's Eve in Keflavik. And by that time we were pretty much starting to gang up. We'd had a few stragglers, but I suppose over half of our unit was there. And we thought for sure we'd have New Year's Day off, because boy, it was pretty hazardous trip. It was over a month we'd been en route already, close to 40 days, 12 hours of flying time to get to Europe, but sitting all these different bases in the weather. So about 6 o'clock that evening, they called over from headquarters in Germany and said, you got to leave the next morning, leave at 8 o'clock. So New Year's Day we launched a whole bunch of airplanes, and we flew into 3 different German bases. My squadron went to Bitburg. The 62nd Squadron, where Finnegan was in, went to Spangdahlem, which was about 20 miles away. And then the other squadron went up to Hahn, Germany, which was up north, maybe 80, 90 miles. So they said we'd be there for about a month at the most in Germany. We had a nuclear storage site in Germany at Spangdahlem Air Base. That's where we kept our nukes. When we moved to France, the French wouldn't allow any nukes. So when we moved to France, we had to leave them behind. And so if we had to go on a mission, we were only maybe 80 miles from Spangdahlem, and we'd fly over there with just internal fuel. Land, and they'd strap the bomb on, fill us up with fuel. Then we'd go from there to our target. Well, in the meantime, then our wives started coming over, and so it turned into about 7 or 8 months before our base was ready in France. So we enjoyed it in Germany. The Germans had already done a miraculous recovery from World War II. This was still during the occupation. The occupation lasted until 58. This was in 55. So it was still a lot of recovery, but the economy was just starting to really rapidly improve over there. So it was pretty nice living in Germany. And then, of course, about 8 months later, we were we flew over to the French base, which was only about 100 miles west of us, called Étain-Rouges. Étain, we called it Étain Air Base, Etain, and that was at Verdun, France, about 8 miles out of Verdun, which was very famous for World War I history. And an amazing thing, when I went to Verdun, we'd fly over it once in a while from Bitburg just to look at the base, and it was all pockmarked. It was kind of hilly, like around Detroit Lakes or Fergus Falls, the terrain about like that. But every hilltop had ridge lines, trenches, World War I yet. And the whole countryside was solid pockmarks from bomb craters. But you didn't see that from the road if you're driving. You just see it from the air. So that's where we ended up at Étain, France for a couple of years. Our daily missions over in Europe were to practice our mission, which was delivery of an atomic weapon, and we would. This was all low-level navigation. We didn't have GPS, so daily missions out of Bitburg, Germany, or Étain, France, we would go up and practice. We would pick a city somewhere, simulating one of our target cities. And then we'd fly different headings to get to that, because you couldn't fly a straight line or intelligence would get you. So, but we had to do, it was no radio navigation, it was all pilotage, dead reckoning. You'd fly to a railroad track, you'd fly to a river, you'd fly to some definite piece of real estate on the ground, and you'd go time and distance at 500 knots. At 50 foot, or right on the deck. So it was very precise navigation, because we didn't have any of the fancy stuff they have now. And of course, in enemy territory, you wouldn't have it anyway. So now, to practice our bombing mission, all the fighter units in Europe, we didn't have air-to-ground ranges. We had them in Libya, Tripoli, Wheelus Air Force Base, and they rotated wings of fighters through Wheelus year-round. We had to go there twice a year for 6 to 8 weeks at a time. So in 3 years, I spent 6 months of my life in Libya, and it was it was a large air base, because it was a refueling base too, and they had a lot of transports going through there. But the thing that was unique, it was this Sahara Desert. It was nothing but desert, sand dunes as far as you could see. And we had a range called El Watia that was about 60 miles from the base, and we'd go out there and do our labs deliveries and practice our Immelmans. But we changed over, and we would do a loop. We found out if we did a loop, we'd gain a little bit more safe separation time from the bomb. So We found that out over in New Mexico right before we left. And when we got over to Europe, we really refined that. Because the other thing, with doing Immelman, you had to have an IP about 2 to 3 miles from the target. How are you going to find an IP over in enemy territory? You know, they usually would use a bridge or a river or something like that. So it really improved the mission when we changed to a loop, because then we used the target as the IP. So you'd come ripping over the landscape at 500 knots, and when you hit the target, you'd hit the pickle button and start your 4G pull-up. And once you got about 110 degrees, a little past vertical, the bomb would leave the airplane and go up to about 12,000 feet and reverse itself. And by that time, hopefully you're at the bottom of the loop, right on the deck, full throttle, to get away from the blast. Then the bomb would come straight down and detonate. Well, now back to practice and dropping these 9-pound practice bombs. We had a 900-foot circle. That was our bombing circle. And we had a range officer, and the lieutenants would get that duty about once a month, or we'd go out and spend a day at the gunnery range scoring these targets. And we had to qualify. We had to get, if I remember, I think we had to get 6 out of 9 bombs in to qualify. And if we didn't, then we'd lose our bomb commander rating. We couldn't drop you had to requalify. Every year you had to requalify. So it was rather serious that you had to do this right. Once you did that, then we'd go out in the range, we'd fire at the rag, and we'd do conventional gunnery. But I crossed the Mediterranean about a dozen times going back and forth, but it was warm water. I didn't mind the Mediterranean like the North Atlantic. In Germany, when we just flew practice missions, we also had another mission. The Russian MiGs would go over and intercept us. So they'd come over and just intrude or bother us quite often, darn near daily. They'd fly it. They'd cross, the Iron Curtain, was a definite line which you could see from altitude. It was just like about a 20-mile swath cut through East and West Germany, where it's no man's land. And they would violate very often. So we had another mission where we'd have to fly daytime alert down at a base in Germany called Fürstenfeldbruck. And we'd go down there for about 6 weeks and sit daytime alert, hot alert with 4 hot airplanes, all armed, ready to go. And you'd get a hot scramble maybe at least, I would say, a couple times a week. And you'd intercept the MiGs, and they would fly right straight towards the border, and then we'd fly, and as soon as their radar would have us, then they'd turn parallel, and you could parallel them. And one time, a MiG came over. He must have been a wild fighter pilot. He came over and did a touch and go at the base at Fürstenfeldbruck, a MiG-15, and flew back. But we had some of them defect, too, and they would defect. We had a couple of them defect while I was there. And they would land, and of course, we would capture the airplanes, and we would turn them into a different person so they wouldn't be punished. I was intercepted by a MiG night flying once over Germany. I was with my squadron commander, and the two of us. It was a moonlit night, and he saw. It was quite a bright moon, and he saw what he thought was an airplane. He turned, and here it went right by us, and he saw the red star. I didn't, because I was flying his wing, but we had a MiG make an intercept on us at night, which surprised us, because it certainly wasn't by accident, I don't think. The weather in Germany and France was different than here. We had a lot of low visibility, a lot of low ceilings, fog, rain. We didn't have thunderstorm or tornado type weather, but a lot of fog, and in the wintertime, sometimes we'd go 2-3 weeks straight with 0-0, where we just couldn't fly. It was just too foggy. And then what we would do, as soon as we got the minimums, we'd take off and fly to southern bases just to get some flying time. And I flew into Marseille, France quite a bit because right on the coast, and take another airplane with me, and we just go fly for 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 times a day, and get some time in. But it was a fun tour of duty over there because it was always something different, and we had an interesting mission. We wondered whether it was a one-way mission. We didn't talk about that then because if you're going over to drop a bomb and the weather's bad, well, we didn't have a lot of bases with radar facilities. So some of my missions, I was told to land on the Autobahn on the way back. Well, what if the weather's bad? You can't make an instrument letdown. What do you do? So we didn't. We just kind of played along with it and decided, well, that's the way you do it. Find a place to land or bail out, But it was a rather unique mission to have that as your primary mission, really. Especially being, at that time, I thought there were other ones that had that same mission, other fighters, but we were the only fighter unit on the continent that had the atomic mission. I was gone an average of over 250 days a year. She really very seldom knew where I was going or when I'd be back. We didn't have cell phones. We did have phones on the base, but we didn't have them in our quarters. And when we lived in Luxembourg City, we didn't have a telephone because there weren't phones like there are now. So she'd see me when I'd show up. It was tough on the wives. It really was. And we had accidents over there too. Backing up to the high flight, we lost 3 airplanes on the way over on that flight over the North Atlantic, but one of them in Dover, Delaware, one of them in Prestwick, Scotland, and the third one in our final landing spot in Bitburg, Germany. The day after I got there, we had a flight of 2 come in from England, and the weather was a little snow squall, and the flight lead lost his radio, and wingman took over, fairly inexperienced young wingman, and he got vertigo and crashed right in the middle of Bitburg, but didn't take any civilians, just himself. So we lost 3 airplanes, had 1 fatal on the trip over. But then when we were in Europe, I suppose we lost 3 or 4 people, and mostly weather-related accidents, and just the type of flying we were doing, low level. Well, this F-86 normally would carry 2 drop tanks under the wings, 2 drop tanks. It could carry 4. The 2 outer ones were the big ones, 200 gallons each. And then they had inboard stations where you could carry 2 120-gallon tanks. The atomic bomb was similar to the 120-gallon. It was a little bigger, but similar. So what we would do is fly with the 2 tanks, the 2 big 200-gallon tanks, and 1 inboard tank, which simulated the bomb. So we'd fly around with 3, what we called an asymmetrical configuration when we got to Europe, just to get used to flying with 3 tanks on board. They'd all know the other F-86s. Oh, there's a F-86 from Italy, France. They're the only ones with that mission. We were the only fighter unit on the continent of Europe to have that mission, which I didn't realize at the time. Now, there was a unit in England at Wethersfield that had a similar mission with F-84s, with fighter. They carried a Mark 12, a Mark 7 atomic bomb, which was fatter and a few more kiloton. It was a 20 kiloton. Ours was a Mark 12, which was 12 kiloton. And it was more slender because the F-86 sat lower on the ground. And in fact, at the rear of the bomb, it had 4 fins. And the bottom fins were retractable because on takeoff, you rotated quite heavy and they would rub on the ground otherwise. So the first thing you do as you get airborne is extend the fins so they'd be more aerodynamic. We had a special panel with just the bomb switches on it, where we could, when I think back on it, it was amazing. I'm talking 1950s engineering. You could do a lot from the cockpit arming that bomb. You had three choices. You could do three different types of burst, and the pilot could select that. Now, I'm sure on briefings we would have been told whether we wanted an air burst, a surface burst, or a penetrating burst. And the bomb actually had a small radar set in it. So if you could do a timer burst or you could do a radar burst. So the pilot could select all those things from the cockpit, which was rather unique for a single seat young 20-some-year-old fighter pilot to be given that responsibility. And then also, well, I may be getting ahead of myself, but the nuclear, the sphere of plutonium was about I'd say like a kitten ball. And that wasn't in the, I can go into this later, but the bomb itself was surrounded by detonators with high explosive. But you could run that plutonium into the center of that sphere. But on takeoff, until you got over the bomb line, the plutonium wasn't in the bomb. So if it accidentally dropped, you might get just a detonation from the high explosive, but the nuke wouldn't detonate. When you cross the bomb line, then you do what they called IFI, which is in-flight insertion. You'd hit the switch and it would run the nuclear inside that sphere, that round sphere. And that's the way you get your nuclear detonation, because when it would fire, those 92 detonators would fire all at one time, and they would implode because they were in a sphere. And they'd implode to the point of criticality, and that's where you got your nuclear blast. It was a good airplane, yeah. It had a lot of good backup. It had, two hydraulic flight control systems, so if one was shot out, you had a secondary system, and if that was shot out, you could go electric until your battery ran dead. So it was a nice flying airplane. It was supersonic, not straight level. You could go through the sound barrier if you dove it straight down, or fairly straight down. And so when we graduated from Nellis in the F-86, we got the Mach-Buster pin. We each got a pin with, we'd have to go through Mach 1, then that was a big deal going through Mach 1. And when you went through the speed of sound with the 86, you dove it just about vertical from about 40,000 feet at least. And as it went through Mach 1, you'd get a lot of wing roll and a little buffeting. But then once it exceeded Mach 1, you'd see it on the airspeed needle. It would jump, and then you knew you were supersonic. Well, then it was time to pull out. But it was a nice flying airplane, very forgiving, and didn't have any bad characteristics. It was just a nice airplane. In about 1958, 59, about the time I came back from Europe, the F-100s were starting to come back into play, or come into play, brand new ones. And they had, some of those had the atomic delivery mission too. Some were air-to-air, some were, the fighter-bomber version. But I didn't fly the F-100. I flew the F-102, which is a Century Series, same engine, but a little different type. It was a Delta airplane. I flew that when I got the Guard. When I was over in France about 6 months before my tour was up, I got a letter from Marsh Johnson, and he and Mac had gotten together, and he decided to write me a letter and invite me to come back and join the Guard. They said, "We've got room for you. We're filled up with Korean people, ex-Korean veterans, but being that you had been in the unit before and you're North Dakotan, we'll find a spot for you." Well, the next morning I went into Major Carr, my squadron commander, and saluted him and said, "Major Carr, I want out. I want to go home." And he said, no, you got to stay. He said, "I'll promote you to captain if you stay." And I said, "Let me think it over. I'll let you know in the morning." So Gene and I talked about it. And we both decided, let's apply for release. So it took about 4 or 5 months to get everything ironed out. In the meantime, once I decided to get out, we had a Hungarian crisis, and we thought we were going to war over there.
Mm-hmm.
And I had already taken my car to port, which you did about 6 weeks before you left. And I got back, I took it to La Police, which is on the coast of France, and took the train back to Etienne Air Base. And one of my squadron buddies picked me up, and he said, you're not leaving, we're going to war. And you got to check out your equipment, you're going back on alert. I'd already turned in some of my stuff, and man, I went back on alert, and we were, that was during the Hungarian crisis, and they, that's when Russia was killing some of the Hungarians, and it was really close. And before that, we had a Suez crisis, which we thought was going to escalate into something too. But while I was gone to take my car to port, it was about a 3-day deal. They called all the wives together and had them meet at the base theater in France, and told them to get a 5-gallon can of gas put in the trunk, buy a box of groceries, and if anything happens, head west. Just head west till you hit the coast. Now, I got back to the base, and Jean had pretty wide eyes. Terry was a baby, and she was about a year old, and it was very uncomforting, and she'd know that I wouldn't be leaving with her. I'd be doing my mission. So it was rather tense for the wives over there, especially with us being gone so much. Terry was born, in fact, we didn't have maternity facilities at our base hospital in France when I was there, so if you had a baby born, they'd have to go over to a German hospital or a air-based hospital at Bitburg. And so a friend of mine, Finnegan, had an apartment in Bitburg because he was still stationed there. So he was going somewhere on leave, so he said, you can use my apartment. So Jean and I drove over, and my operations officer, Major John Bloomer, said, my wife is going to be due at the same time. And he'd already gone to the base in France, was working there, so he said, can you take Jean along with you? It was a 2-bedroom apartment, so here I'm with these 2 pregnant women. And so about the second day, Jean said, take me to the hospital. About 6 in the morning, I whipped her over to the hospital, and I came back there and spent the day with this other lady who I didn't know that well, and she was ready to deliver too. So the next morning, about 3 o'clock, banging on my bedroom door, Darrol, take me to the hospital. Here, the same shift was on at the hospital. The next morning, here I walk in, Lieutenant Schroeder, what are you doing here? I walk in with another. So our 2 babies were born just 24 hours apart. And then I called him and told him to get over there. I didn't want to sit with her while she was delivering. So at that time, we actually lived in Luxembourg City. And Jean was in the hospital for a couple of days. We drove back to Luxembourg City. We had a nice apartment there. And Luxembourg City was a very nice place to live then. And the new baby, which I'd seen only for a day, and I had to leave the next day for a 2-week school over in Chaumont, France, to go to another special weapons training course. And so I couldn't really tell Jean when I'd be back, so I just said, I'm going. And I just left for 2 weeks. I got there in 55 and left there in 57. So about close to 3-year mission over there. In fact, Jean and I made 16 moves from the time I went in until I got out. And that's the way it kind of went, you just, it was tough on the dependents. And even the ones that had kids, in school, they'd be going to the air base, or the base schools, and their dad would be gone all the time, and it was tough. The Cold War. When we left Etienne, France, towards the end of '57, and took a train to Paris, about 200-mile trip, and checked into the Litre Hotel to wait for our flight home. And here they told us that all the flights were canceled because the Hungarian crisis had just was in the process of being over with. They had a lot of refugees and they were flying them to the States. So we thought maybe we would have to wait a day or two. And now they ran out of fuel and heat in Paris, so the hotel was unheated, and we were there for a whole week. And each day I'd have to go and check the manifest on the wall to see if we were on it. And after about a week, we finally were listed on the manifest. So we left from Orly Field in a DC-7 chartered airplane with a whole bunch of dependents and little babies, and I was one of the only men on the airplane. So it was kind of an interesting trip back to New Jersey. And because of the delays, I got to the center where we get our discharges, and in New Jersey, McGuire Air Force Base, and here they closed for 2 weeks for Christmas. Well, I went completely into panic. I wanted to get home for Christmas, but I'd gone 3 years, and my parents were waiting for us, and I finally talked them into letting me go, but they extended me for a month of active duty and assigned me to the fighter unit in Minneapolis. They still had a fighter unit there, and they transferred me to that unit. Just this kind of small trivia items, but it was kind of a memorable trip home. Then I had to go pick up my car from the port, which I had purchased over in Germany, and we drove back to North Dakota. And it was nice. We ate hamburgers quite a few times because we hadn't had a good hamburger for a long time. And it was just neat to get back to the United States after being gone for 3 years. And we enjoyed Europe, but my 6 months in Libya was something I didn't want to put a lot of memories to. But I came back, and I knew that I'd be joining the Guard because that's why I asked for a release from active duty. So as soon as we got back, I checked in out the Guard. Marsh Johnson was the group commander then, and he said, well, we'd love to have you back, because I'd been in previously for about a 2-year, 7-month enlistment before I went on active duty in high school and college. I was in the unit. So anyway, I joined the Guard and got all the paperwork done in April of that year, and started flying. They checked me out in a T-Bird, and Palmer Saturn, I don't know if you knew Paul Saturn, his dad was a major, and he was a World War II pilot, and he gave me my check ride, and it was, of course, he passed me and made me an IP and a flight examiner in the airplane, so they had F-94C, so I flew the T-Bird for a couple of weeks just to get kind of loosened up again, and checked out in the 94C, which was a 2-place interceptor. Now, that's the first time I flew with the backseater. Kind of interested to hear someone else breathing in the back end and groaning when I pull some G's and that type of thing. But we had the F-94s for probably, I'm going to guess, a couple of years. And then we went into the F-89. That was a 2-engine interceptor. And I thought, gee, I'm going downhill. The F-86 was quite a nice airplane. I went to the F-94, straight-winged interceptor, and then the 89 was a great big airplane, and I thought, man, I'm just going downhill. Well, after about, I think we had 2 models of the F-89, yes, we did, and then we got the F-102 Delta, and that was a nice airplane. I really enjoyed flying the 102. And then we didn't have the backseater, so we learned how to be a radar observer also, so we do the intercept and the flying of the airplane, which was rather difficult for a little while till you got used to flying the airplane, also running the radar at the same time. So that was an enjoyable airplane. About that time, I think I was promoted to major when, after about maybe 4 years or so, and became a flight commander, and we had a lot of good flying. We had a lot of great people. I think about a third of our pilots were airline pilots. About 4 or 5 of us were ag pilots, crop dusters, and then just a mix of people. We had Bernie Altenberg was a physician with the Fargo Clinic, and had a couple lawyers, and just an interesting mix of people, a little different than active duty. Some were full-time and some were part-timers. Then as the years went on, during this time we lived in Davenport. We built a home. I lived on the farm in a small house that had been vacated by some hired help, and we moved in there while we built our new home in Davenport. And Terry enrolled in school then. She was about 4 or 5 when we got back. She wasn't in school yet. And so I became a farmer and a guard pilot and a crop duster, all three. Kept busy, enjoyed it very much. Then as things progressed through the years, we got the F-101s, and about that time I was promoted to 1-star. I was chief of staff for air for the state, and that was a flying status job, fortunately. Otherwise I probably wouldn't have taken it, but no, I wouldn't have turned it down, but I was very fortunate to still be able to fly airplanes. And nowadays, general officers, very few are still flying airplanes. They usually get desk jobs and things like that. So I was chief of staff for probably about 4 years, and then I got a call from the Pentagon to see if I'd like to be the Air Guard assistant to NORAD in Colorado Springs. And I just didn't know what that really would consist of. I know it'd take me out of the area once in a while, and so I went into D.C. into the Pentagon and talked to the Guard Bureau, and there were, at that time, there were 6 2-star assistants, Air National Guard assistant to NORAD, Tactical Air Command, Strategic Air Command, Air Research and Development Command, and Europe. And that was a 3-year assignment as a 2-star. Well, I took the NORAD job and enjoyed it. I usually could go out there with an F-4 or T-33. I probably averaged probably 2 or 3 trips a month out there, some for a few days, some for a week. And it was just a neat assignment. I enjoyed it very much, and General Hardinger was a kind of a character. He was the 4-star head of NORAD, and it became Space Command also when I was there. So that was a rather exciting, thing to have a new command called Space Command and be part of that group. And we had some nice trips, and it was just a nice assignment. And after the 3 years was up, I was called to check in with the Guard Bureau, and I thought, well, they'll give me my certificate of retirement and my medal, and I'm all done probably. I'd love to have stayed. I really was wanting to stay on, and that was about in 82, 83. Well, then, when I went to the Guard Bureau, John Conaway was the director, and John had been a good friend for a long time. In fact, we went to safety school out at USC when I was a brand new major, and he was too, and we got to know each other there. And John called me in his office, and he said, you've had a good tour with NORAD, and everybody liked the job you did, and now I'm going to ask you for some help. I need to fill a slot in USAFE, U.S. Air Forces Europe. Now that's one that everybody wanted. They were just fighting for that assignment. And I've got about 16 general officers, and I want you to go down the list and tell me which ones you think would be qualified. That one, someone who's had a tour in Europe that's still on flying status, that's a fighter pilot, and he named off a few things, and I went up and down the list, and I said, there's 1 or 2 that might be the ones, but I really can't see anybody that that would fill all those requirements. Well, he said, how about you? And I said, really? He said, you're it. So I was assigned to U.S. Air Forces Europe as a special assistant to the commander of Europe, or the commander of Air Forces Europe, and checked in to Ramstein in 1983, and that was a wonderful assignment. It was still a flying status assignment, so I could still fly airplanes, which was extremely nice. I was current in the F4, and I worked for 3 different 4-stars. Well, that was a 3-year assignment, but after the 3 years was up, they extended me twice because they just wanted me to stay on, so I had it really for 5 years. And a sideline to that, the second 4-star there was General Donnelly, and I had known Donnelly a few years before that. We got along real good. In fact, he called me by my nickname Corky, which I kind of got a kick out of. And as we were getting reacquainted, he said, you know, if we're mobilized, over half my forces over here would be National Guard, Air National Guard. And he said they fly a variety of airplanes, as you well know, but I think it'd be good if you got familiar with any ones that you haven't flown. So you have my total authorization to get executive checkouts in any of them. Well, that was a very, very nice offer. So in the meantime, I would periodically, when I was back in the States, I'd get checkouts. I went to Luke, got checked out in the F-15 and the F-16. Went to Tucson, got checked out in the A-7, the Corsair A-7. Got checked out in the A-10. And I think that's all the models of the F-4. There were 3 models, and I flew all 3 at all of those. And to top it off, I'd become pretty good friends with the German general. His name was Jungkirth, and he later on became commander of the Luftwaffe, and he was a 2-star, and we were having lunch together one day in Heidelberg, and we were talking about flying, and he wore American wings because he trained some in the States in 104s at Phoenix. And I said, you know, it's an airplane I've always wanted to fly as a 104. He said, it's done. What? He said, go down to Lechfeld and get checked out in one. So I did. So I flew the 104. It's quite a different airplane, and I enjoyed that. So that was kind of an added feature. Now, the job in Europe was rather exciting because we had so many units. We had 53 bases on the continent in Europe that were called COBs, co-located operating bases. And if we were mobilized for a war, we would immediately start occupying those bases with different units, some active duty, some Air Force Reserve, and some Air National Guard. Well, one of my really major jobs over there was to visit those units and visit the bases. They were in Turkey and Norway and Italy and Greece and Germany and you know, pretty much all over the continent. And so I made numerous trips to Turkey, and we didn't have any COBs in Israel, but I made a number of trips to Israel and visited with the Israeli Defense Forces, which was rather fascinating. So it was really a nice job. And after, in 1989, I completed my 5 years, and I came back here, and in 1990 I was given my release from the Air Force, retired. So since then I've been working with the Air Museum, as you well know, and watching my farm being rented out and checking the crops and going to the lake and enjoying life. We had a number of warbirds in the area, and you know, Jerry Beck and Bob Odegaard, and of course they had friends with warbirds, and I have a personal friend that lives in a number of places down south who's extremely wealthy, and he has a lot of different warbirds, quite a collection, in about 3 different museums. And we had a fly-in here, and I think it was probably an air show that we had, and right after I came back from when I got out of the Air Force or the Guard, and Dick and I were talking one day, and I just made the comment, you know, it'd be neat to have a museum here. And that kind of sparked it. So we started visiting about that, and we talked to Odegaard and Beck, and they thought it was a great idea. But we didn't know if we could support a museum in Fargo. So I called my friend Tom Friedkin and told him what our plan was, and asked him what he thought of that idea, because he's had a lot of involvement in Chino, California, and Grand Canyon Airport, and Galveston. And Tom said, well, he said, there's one guy that you ought to get a hold of, and you tell him that you and I talked. His name is Jim Fowles, and he's made some museum startups, and he's helped me with some. And so he gave me his contact. He lived down in Pensacola, retired Navy pilot. So I called Jim Fowles, and this was in January, and I told him that what our plan was. And he said, well, he said, I normally would never travel to North Dakota in January, but he said, as long as Tom Friedkin suggested me, I'd be glad to do it. And so I said, well, we'll pay your ticket, and I don't know if we have any money for a consulting, but no, he said, you buy my ticket and that'll be enough. We sent him about a foot-high box of material from North Dakota and Fargo and Moorhead, and you know, I've worked with a number of consultants in my years. I've never seen one this thorough. He had studied everything we sent him, and he came here and spent 3 days, and we called a meeting, Dick and I, and we had about a dozen people up in the airport administration office, and in Doberstein's office, and he, in conclusion, he said, you've got all the ingredients to have a successful museum. And he wrote up a 2-page paper, which I still have. And, you know, he said location, location, location many times. And he said 19th Avenue, across from the Dome, and he kept naming all on the airport property. He said you couldn't have any better. Ramp space, access to the airport. He said, man, he said, it'll work. So that's what kicked it off.
How did you and Wallstead ever hook up to start this air show thing?
We've been at it over 20 years now, and it's a very unique committee because, you know, Dick and I get along so well. We've never had a dispute at all in 20 years, not one. And we always come to an agreement after a little discussion sometimes, but Dick is just so easy to work with, and he really loves the airshow business. He does a good job, and is quite a good leader for all of the group. And you know, we have such a unique committee. They're a very diverse group, as you all know, and that's what makes it work. We just get along great. Well, I think the fact that I was fortunate enough to fly F-86s and had a tour in Europe was really a major event in my life. Just never thought it would ever happen that this farm boy from Davenport, North Dakota would end up with that kind of an assignment. And when I came back, it was really neat to fly in the Guard, meet a lot of good people. And of course, the real honor was to be promoted general officer. And that really, it was so great to mix with so many great people after that assignment, and especially with the NORAD and the Air Force's Europe assignment. I just met tons of the neatest people, and that really just was made it a lot of fun. And in my other life, in the agricultural world, I enjoyed ag flying. I really did. It was just great flying. I met so many great people, and the farmers were good customers, and never had a problem at all. 33 years of ag flying, and I had some good pilots and nice airplanes, and I really look back on that as being a real good chapter in my life. You know, here I could fly fighters and I could fly crop dusters all at the same time. I mean, it was, people say, you know, isn't that kind of dangerous? And I'd say, if I thought I was, I wouldn't do it. So Just really had a great time doing that. Accumulated a lot of different flying in about 130 some different airplanes in my career. I enjoy flying other airplanes, and so I've been in some real unique ones, and I've always enjoyed that too. Jean got in contact with all three of her French. Her mother was part French.
Oh, really?
And her her Swedish and her Norwegian relatives, and we've been over to visit all three places.
That's
and
very cool.
She's made books on the Norwegians. The book is a masterpiece. It's about this. She took her a year or two. A lot of families don't do that. Jean will ask some friends that are Norwegian, where'd your relatives come from in Norway? I really don't know. Never really.